It was an ordinary sunny morning in the small town of Ridgewood. The sky was clear, the birds were singing, and the gentle breeze made the trees sway lightly. It was one of those days when everything seemed to be going smoothly, and nothing could ruin the peace. For Jessica Williams, wife of the famous wrestler Tommy, the Titan Williams, it was just another trip to the grocery store. She was looking forward to a quiet day at home, preparing a meal for her husband after his intense week of training for an upcoming match. As Jessica walked out of the store, bags filled with groceries in hand, she was looking forward to nothing more than returning home. But everything changed in an instant when she was suddenly stopped by two police officers. Their stern expressions immediately made her stomach churn. They didn't say much at first, just looked at her suspiciously. She felt a strange unease growing within her, and she asked politely, "Is everything all right, officer?" Without answering her, one of the officers began searching her grocery bags. "Excuse me, ma'am, we need to check these bags for something illegal," the officer said, his voice cold and firm. Jessica was stunned. She had done nothing wrong. Why was she being stopped? Why were they acting as if she had something to hide? She tried to explain she was just shopping for her family, but the officers weren't listening. They continued rifling through her bags, pulling out the items one by one. Every second felt like an eternity. The sense of powerlessness and fear began to creep in. Why was this happening? She couldn't understand it. Suddenly, one of the officers pulled out a small box from her bag. It wasn't hers. She had never seen it before in her life. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "I don't know what that is," Jessica stammered, her hands trembling. "It's not mine, I swear." But the officers were not convinced. They looked at each other, and the silence that followed made Jessica's heart race even faster. It was as if they had already made up their minds that she was guilty of something. She felt a wave of panic wash over her. This was not how her day was supposed to go. She needed to explain, but in that moment, she couldn't think clearly. She needed help, and there was only one person she could turn to: Tommy, her husband. Tommy was the man who could fix anything. He had always been there to support her, and now she needed him more than ever. But as the officers continued their questioning, all she could think was, would he be able to get here in time? Are you hooked and wondering what will happen next? How will Tommy respond when he finds out what's happening to Jessica? Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Make sure to like this post if you're enjoying it so far. Subscribe to get more intense, action-packed stories like this one, and share it with your friends. Let's see how far this story can go. And tell us, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay tuned for the next part, where everything changes. Jessica's mind was spinning. Her heart raced as the officer's fingers brushed over the contents of her bags. She couldn't understand what was happening. She had just come from the store, buying food for her husband, Tommy, and their two kids. She had no idea how she had ended up in the middle of an interrogation. She had nothing to hide, but the officer's cold, unblinking eyes made her feel like she was being accused of something much worse than just picking up groceries. The officer pulled out a small, unmarked box from one of her bags. The box was plain, with no labels or markings, just a simple brown paper wrapping. It didn't belong to her, and she didn't know where it had come from. Her heart sank as she watched the officer's eyes narrow, suspicion written all over his face. "Ma'am, we're going to need to inspect this further," the officer said, holding the box up in front of her face. "I swear, I don't know where that came from," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "I didn't put that there. It's not mine." But the officer didn't seem to care. His expression remained unchanged as he handed the box to his partner, who quickly began inspecting it. Jessica could feel her stomach tightening. She could see the fear in the officer's eyes as they continued to search, almost as if they were looking for something. She tried to stay calm, but panic was bubbling up inside her. What if they found something? What if they thought I was hiding something? "I'm just here to buy groceries for my family," she repeated, hoping they would believe her. But her voice felt small and weak against the growing tension. The officers didn't respond. They simply went through her things as if they had already made up their minds about her guilt. The longer the officers took, the more Jessica's sense of helplessness grew. It felt like she was losing control of the situation, like it was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Why wasn't Tommy here? She thought desperately. He was the one person who could make everything right. Tommy, the wrestler known for his strength and determination, had always been her protector. He had always been the one to stand up for her. And now, when she needed him most, he was far away, training for his next big match. The officer who was holding the box looked at Jessica again, his eyes piercing. "You don't seem to know much about this package, do you?" "I don't," she exclaimed, her voice cracking under the pressure. "I swear to you, I don't know how it ended up in my bag. I've never seen it before. I'm not lying." For a moment, the officer stood silently, his gaze never leaving her face. Jessica could see the disbelief in his eyes. He wasn't hearing her. He was judging her. She could feel it in her bones. He had already decided she was guilty of something, and nothing she said would change his mind. Then, without a word, the officer signaled to his partner to take the box inside the patrol car. Jessica's anxiety spiked as the officer who had been questioning her turned his full attention to her, the air between them thick with tension. "Ma'am, we're going to need to take you down to the station for further questioning," the officer said coldly. Jessica's chest tightened. "What? No, please, I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to go home." She looked around, hoping someone might step in to help, but the parking lot was empty. She was alone, standing in front of two officers who had already made up their minds. The officer's voice was firm and unyielding. "We're just following protocol. You'll have the chance to explain everything at the station." Jessica's mind raced. The station. This couldn't be happening. I haven't done anything wrong. The thought of being taken to a police station made her stomach churn. Her mind jumped to the worst possible outcome, being locked up, treated like a criminal, with no one to help her. Her world was crumbling, and she felt utterly powerless. She needed Tommy. She needed him to fix this, to tell the officers that they were making the huge mistake. Tommy, the one person who had always protected her, the one person who could make everything right. But where was he? Desperately, she pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed his number. It rang and rang. No answer. "Tommy, please pick up," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She dialed again, but there was still no response. Panic began to swell in her chest. What if he doesn't answer? What if he is too far away? What if I have to face this nightmare alone? The officer's voice brought her back to reality. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us now. We don't have all day. Please, just give me a minute," Jessica pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. She had to reach Tommy. He had to know. Suddenly, she felt a car pull up, tires screeching as it came to a halt. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the familiar figure of Tommy jump out of the car, his tall, muscular frame cutting through the air like a storm. He had arrived. But there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before. He looked shaken. His eyes were wide, his jaw tight, and his fists were clenched. This wasn't the calm, confident Tommy she knew. This was a man who was scared, a man who was afraid for her. And for the first time, Jessica realized that this wasn't just an inconvenience. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something much bigger. Tommy rushed over to her, his voice booming with authority. "What's going on here?" His eyes scanned the officers before settling on Jessica. "What have you done to her?" The officers took a step back, clearly startled by Tommy's sudden appearance. They didn't seem prepared for someone like him. Jessica could see Tommy's fury growing. "What is this? Why are you treating my wife like a criminal? She's done nothing wrong." His voice was strong, but there was a crack of worry in it too. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the anger and fear flooding through him. He had never felt more powerless, more helpless in his life. The officers tried to explain, but Tommy wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Jessica's, his mind focused on her, his protector instinct kicking into overdrive. "I'll handle this, Jess. Don't worry. Everything is going to be okay." But even as he said the words, he could feel his legs shaking beneath him, his whole body trembling with a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness. He had always been the one to step into the ring and fight for what was right. But this was different. He wasn't fighting against an opponent. He was fighting for his family, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to win. Are you on the edge of your seat, wondering what happens next? How will Tommy handle this situation? Will he be able to protect Jessica, or will things spiral out of control? Like this post if you're hooked. Subscribe to find out what happens next, and share this story with your friends to get them hooked too. And tell us, where are you watching from? We want to know. Stay tuned for the next part, where everything is about to change. Tommy's thoughts ran wild. What did they think she has done? Why is she being treated this way? His protective instincts kicked in full force, and the anger that burned inside him made his hands ball into fists. He couldn't allow this. Not to his wife, not to his family. "Jessica," Tommy called out, his voice rising with relief and anger. His feet pounded against the pavement, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. The officers looked up at him, startled by his sudden presence. Jessica looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Tommy, please help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tommy felt his chest tighten as he saw the tears in her eyes. This wasn't the woman he had known. This wasn't the woman who always kept a cool head in tough situations. This was the woman he loved, who had just been humiliated and wrongly accused, standing there like she was guilty of something she didn't even understand. And it tore him apart. His protective instincts surged. He quickly stepped between the officers and Jessica, his broad frame blocking their view of her. His eyes locked on the officers, and for the first time, they hesitated. Tommy's reputation as a wrestler was known far and wide, but it was his sheer presence, his intensity, that made the officers pause. "What's going on here?" Tommy demanded, his voice booming, full of authority. "Why is my wife being treated like this? What did she do?" The officers glanced at each other nervously, clearly unnerved by Tommy's sudden arrival and the way he loomed over them. The taller officer, the one who had been speaking to Jessica earlier, shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain his composure. "She's under suspicion of carrying something illegal," the officer said, his voice clipped. "We found a suspicious package in her bag. We need to take it to the station for further investigation." Tommy's eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched in disbelief. "What do you mean suspicious package? She's done nothing wrong. She's just shopping for groceries." Jessica, her voice shaking but stronger now, spoke up. "I don't know how that box ended up in my bag. I swear, I didn't put it there." Tommy turned to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, trying to comfort her as best as he could. He could feel her trembling beneath his touch, and it only fueled the fire burning in his chest. "Jessica, don't worry," he said, his voice softer now, but filled with resolve. "I'm going to fix this. I promise you, we'll get through this." But when he turned back to the officers, he couldn't hide the fury in his eyes. "You think my wife has something illegal in her bag? You've made a huge mistake, and you'll regret this." The officers didn't seem intimidated. They had dealt with angry citizens before, but Tommy wasn't like anyone they had encountered. He wasn't just angry, he was powerful, his presence imposing. He had the reputation of a fighter, but now he was more than that. He was a man who would do anything to protect the people he loved. "I don't care about your investigation," Tommy continued, his voice growing louder, more demanding. "You've made an accusation without any proof. You're ruining my wife's day, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." One of the officers, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped forward. "Sir, we're just doing our job. Please step aside." We have a process to follow." Tommy's body tensed, his fists tightening. His body was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the overwhelming anger that was building inside him, threatening to spill over. He had been trained to fight, to endure pain, to overcome any obstacle in the ring. But this wasn't a match. This wasn't a challenge against an opponent. This was his wife, his family, being disrespected by those who were supposed to protect them. "You don't get to treat her like this," Tommy said, his voice low but filled with fury. "She's innocent, and you have no right to put her through this. Now, I'm going to give you one chance to let her go, or I will make sure this day goes down in your history as the biggest mistake of your careers." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the stories about Tommy, the Titan Williams, the wrestler who was as tough as they come. But standing in front of him now, they weren't so sure how to handle them. He was a man who could move mountains with his strength, and they could feel the weight of his anger. Tommy took a step closer to them, his shadow looming large over the officers. "I'm giving you a choice," he said, his voice steady but heavy with authority. "You let my wife go, and you apologize for wasting her time, or things are going to get ugly for you." Jessica's hand gripped Tommy's, and though she was still shaken, there was a sense of relief in her now. Tommy was here. He had arrived in time. And now he was going to make sure everything would be set right. The tension in the air was thick, as if every word Tommy said carried the weight of 100 battles. The officers stood motionless, unsure of what to do next. Tommy wasn't just a wrestler. He was a force of nature, and they knew they weren't prepared for him. Another few moments of silence passed before one of the officers reluctantly stepped forward. "We're sorry, sir," he muttered. "We should have handled this better. The package was harmless, and there was no reason to involve your wife." Tommy's eyes blazed with anger, but he took a deep breath. "Sorry doesn't cut it. You've wasted our time, treated her like a criminal, and made us both afraid. You better learn from this, because if it happens again, I won't be so understanding." The officer nodded quickly, his face turning red. He seemed embarrassed, but his apology was hollow. Still, the situation had shifted. The officers knew they were beaten, and Tommy had made sure they understood the consequences of their actions. The silence after the officer's apology was almost suffocating. Tommy stood there, his posture tense, fists still clenched, as if ready to throw the first punch if needed. Jessica, still shaken, clung to his arm, seeking comfort in his solid presence. The officers, once brimming with authority, now seemed smaller, their confidence deflating with every second. Tommy wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to his family. He had fought countless battles in the wrestling ring, but this was different. This wasn't a match with clear rules and a referee. This was a test of his integrity, his love for Jessica, and his ability to protect her from the unfair treatment she had suffered. His heart still raced from the adrenaline, but he wasn't going to let it cloud his judgment. No, today he wasn't just going to let this go. Tommy looked down at Jessica, whose eyes were still filled with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "You're okay now, Jess. It's over. You're safe." Jessica nodded, but the fear didn't completely leave her. Her body still trembled slightly from the ordeal. She had always been a strong woman, strong enough to stand beside Tommy through his ups and downs, strong enough to raise their children, strong enough to handle everything life threw at her. But being treated like a criminal, being humiliated in front of strangers, had shaken her deeply. "I'm sorry, Tommy," she whispered, guilt creeping into her voice. "I didn't know what to do. I just felt so powerless." Tommy cupped her face gently with his large hands, his expression softening. "Don't apologize for this. None of this was your fault. You did nothing wrong. You shouldn't have even been in this situation in the first place." His words seemed to reassure her, and she leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth and safety that only Tommy could provide. But there was still a part of him that burned with anger, a part that couldn't let go of the injustice they had just experienced. Tommy turned back to the officers, his voice firm, demanding attention. "You owe my wife more than an apology," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had seen injustice firsthand. "You wasted her time, made her feel like a criminal, and embarrassed her in front of strangers. That's not just something you can brush off with a sorry." The officers, clearly uncomfortable, avoided Tommy's gaze. They were trying to avoid escalating the situation further, but Tommy wasn't done. He wasn't just going to let them walk away without facing the consequences of their actions. He had worked too hard to build a life for his family, and he wasn't going to let these officers get away with ruining Jessica's peace of mind. "Listen, I understand that you're just doing your job," Tommy continued, his tone still intense but measured, "but you need to understand the impact of your actions. My wife is not a criminal, and you treated her like one. She's a mother, a wife, someone who works hard every day for our family. You took that from her today." The officers looked at each other, clearly shaken. Tommy's words had cut through the facade of authority they had tried to maintain. The reality of the situation had finally dawned on them. They had made a mistake, and it was one they couldn't easily walk away from. One of the officers, the younger one, finally spoke up. "You're right," he said, his voice softer than before. "We should have handled this differently. We didn't mean to upset her, but we didn't think this through. We apologize." Tommy's anger simmered, but he kept his composure. "Apologies don't fix this. You've made us both feel like criminals, and you can't just undo that with a few words. The next time you stop someone innocent, you need to think twice. You need to understand that your actions have consequences." The officer nodded, looking down in shame. Tommy was sure they had learned a lesson, but he didn't trust that this was the end. He wasn't about to let them off easily. "I'm not going to let this go," Tommy said, his voice growing steely. "I'll be filing a formal complaint, and you can bet I'm going to make sure your department hears about this." The officers looked at each other again, unsure of how to respond. Tommy wasn't threatening them in an empty way. He was serious. He had the power to take action, and they knew it. "Please, just let us go," Jessica whispered, her voice still shaky. She wanted this to be over, to forget the terrifying experience. She just wanted to go home with Tommy, to feel safe again. Tommy turned back to her, his gaze softening. "We're going, Jess. You've been through enough. Let's go home." But before they could turn away, Tommy made one final point. "I'm not asking for an apology to make me feel better. I'm doing this so that no one else has to go through what you went through today. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." With those final words, Tommy took Jessica's hand, pulling her away from the officers. The officers stood there, watching them leave, clearly aware of the weight of Tommy's words. As they walked toward the car, Tommy didn't look back. He had made his point. It was now up to the officers to do better. Do you believe Tommy's actions will bring real change, or is this just the beginning of a much bigger battle? Subscribe to follow the rest of the story and share it with your friends. Let's get everyone talking about this intense journey. As Tommy and Jessica made their way back to the car, the weight of the situation still lingered in the air. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the parking lot, but neither of them felt the peacefulness that the evening typically brought. Jessica's mind kept replaying the moments of humiliation, the officers' cold stares, their dismissive attitude toward her, the sense of helplessness as they ransacked her bag. But now, with Tommy by her side, she felt an odd sense of strength, even as the tension from the incident still gripped her heart. Tommy's hands were still shaking. He was a wrestler who had taken down hundreds of opponents in the ring, but standing up to injustice, standing up for his wife, felt far more intense. His anger had been fierce, but underneath it was a sense of protectiveness that only grew with every second he spent with Jessica. He hadn't just wanted to stand up to the officers for her. He wanted to make sure they never treated anyone else like this again. They had crossed a line, and Tommy wasn't going to let it slide. As they climbed into the car, Jessica turned to Tommy, her eyes searching his face. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I should have." "Don't," Tommy interrupted, his voice soft yet firm. "You did nothing wrong, Jess. Don't you dare apologize. This isn't on you." He reached for her hand and squeezed it, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm just glad you're okay. That's all that matters." But Jessica could still feel the unease deep inside her. What had just happened had shaken her to her core, and no amount of reassurance could make the feeling go away completely. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, she let out a deep breath, trying to release the tension in her chest. But Tommy wasn't finished yet. As he drove, his mind was racing. The incident today had left an indelible mark on both of them. While he was proud of how he'd handled things, the reality of it all still gnawed at him. He needed to make sure this didn't just fade away. He couldn't let Jessica, or anyone else, be treated like this again. What if there were other people who weren't lucky enough to have someone like him step in? As they reached home, Tommy pulled the car into the driveway, the familiar sight of their cozy home offering a small sense of comfort. The front porch light flickered on, casting a soft glow over the pathway. Inside, their children would be waiting, unaware of the storm that had just passed. But Tommy knew that he couldn't just forget what had happened. He had to do something that would make a difference. "We're not done yet," Tommy said quietly, as they both stepped out of the car. His voice was filled with resolve. Jessica looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle but still wary from the encounter. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I'll start by filing a formal complaint with the department." "But that's just the beginning," Tommy said, his jaw set. "I'm not going to let them forget how they treated you. This isn't just about us. It's about anyone else who's been wrongly accused or treated unfairly." Jessica's eyes softened, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You always know how to make me feel safe, Tommy," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've already done so much. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for you, seeing me go through that." Tommy pulled her into an embrace. "You don't have to worry anymore. We got this. Together." As they stepped inside, the warmth of their home wrapped around them. The kids were in the living room, playing and laughing, oblivious to the tension that had hung in the air just hours before. Jessica took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the ordeal began. She was home now, and Tommy had promised to make sure nothing like this would ever happen again. The week that followed was filled with small victories and frustrations. Tommy followed through with his commitment, making calls to the police department and filing a formal complaint. The officers who had stopped Jessica were questioned, and their actions were scrutinized. The department assured Tommy that they would be investigating the situation fully, but Tommy wasn't satisfied with just that. He demanded more, pushing for a full review of the incident and urging them to undergo further training on how to handle situations like this with greater care and sensitivity. Jessica, though still shaken, felt a sense of relief as Tommy took charge. He wasn't just using his fame to get attention. He was using his voice to make sure something good came out of the experience. And while she wasn't entirely sure that the system would change overnight, she saw Tommy's determination and knew that he would do everything he could to prevent this from happening to anyone else. One afternoon, as Tommy and Jessica were sitting together on the porch, watching the sunset, Tommy looked over at her, his expression softened by the evening light. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this might not be over yet, but we're going to be okay. And whatever happens, I want you to know that you'll never have to face this alone again. We've learned something from this, and I'll make sure we're always ready to protect what matters." Jessica reached over, resting her hand in his. "I don't think I've ever been prouder of you," she said softly, "not just for how you handled everything, but for how you're making sure this doesn't happen again. I feel safe because I know you've got my back." Tommy smiled, but there was something more in his eyes, a sense of pride that he was fighting for something bigger than just their family. He was fighting for what was right, for justice, and for the world they wanted to build. one where fairness, respect, and kindness mattered more than anything else. And in that moment, Tommy knew that this was a fight worth fighting. This wasn't just a lesson for the police officers who had wronged them. It was a lesson for everyone. That standing up for what's right doesn't just change the world. It changes the people who choose to fight. As the weeks passed, Tommy and Jessica's lives slowly returned to normal. But normal was different now. What had happened that day at the grocery store was not just a distant memory. It was a turning point in their lives, a lesson they would never forget. Tommy's actions didn't just stop at filing a complaint. He kept pushing for accountability. He reached out to local community leaders, asking them to advocate for better police training on how to handle such situations with sensitivity and fairness. His voice, combined with the support of Jessica, slowly began to make an impact. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would go through what they had experienced. The town of Ridgewood took notice. Local media picked up the story, and the more people talked about it, the clearer it became. Tommy wasn't just a wrestler. He was a man who would fight for what was right, regardless of the situation. He became a symbol of strength, not just in the ring, but in the fight for justice and fairness. People who had once seen him as a celebrity athlete now looked at him as a leader, a man who used his platform to make the world a better place. Jessica, too, found strength in the aftermath of the ordeal. Although the fear from that day still lingered in her mind at times, she had learned how to stand up for herself, how to demand respect, and how to never let anyone diminish her worth. She and Tommy had grown closer through it all, united in their fight for justice and their deep love for each other. They had learned that no matter how tough the world could be, they could face anything as long as they stood together. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow across the horizon, Tommy and Jessica sat together on their front porch, watching their kids play in the yard. The quiet peace of the moment felt almost surreal after everything they had gone through. The ordeal had changed them, but in many ways, it had made them stronger, both as individuals and as a family. "I don't think I'll ever forget that day," Jessica said, her voice soft but steady. Tommy nodded, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "Neither will I. But it taught me something important. It taught me that we're stronger than any challenge, as long as we stand together. It's not just about winning fights in the ring or beating the odds. It's about doing what's right, standing up for what's fair, and making sure no one gets left behind." Jessica smiled, looking up at him with gratitude and love. "I'm proud of you, Tommy. You're not just my protector. You're my hero." Tommy chuckled softly. "I think you've got that backward. You're my hero, Jess. You've always been. And I'll always stand by you, no matter what." They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the world go by, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The love between them, the trust, the shared strength, they were more than just a family. They were a force to be reckoned with. But the fight for justice didn't stop with them. Tommy knew that there was always more to be done, more people to help, more challenges to face. And as the evening sky darkened, he made a silent promise to himself and to Jessica that he would continue to use his voice and his strength to fight for fairness, to make sure that others wouldn't suffer in silence the way they had. They had been given a platform, a chance to make a difference, and Tommy was determined not to waste it. What do you think of Tommy and Jessica's journey? Do you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult? How would you handle a situation like this? Like this post if you were inspired by their story. Subscribe for more powerful, heart-pounding stories of justice and love, and share this with your friends to spread the message of standing together and fighting for what's right. Where are you watching from? Let's keep this conversation going. Tell us your thoughts and join the movement. Together, we can create a world of fairness, respect, and love. Thank you for watching.